Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today's topic is what have I learned over all these years, because now I am officially 45 years old and I have been seeing clients for 20 years. If you count the very first client that I ever saw in graduate school, those clients would pay like $5 or something per session. Just, you have to pay something in order to have some commitment is the idea there. And I was under supervision, and then I have been out on my own. First I went to a group practice, and then I went out on my own, and now I run a group practice. So over all of these years of seeing clients and growing as a human being and as a therapist and as a mother and a wife and all these things, and I've been divorced and remarried and all of that, what have I learned about relationships? Well, I mean, that probably goes beyond the 12 minutes that I usually allot for these things. But I'll tell you a couple of main points. The first one is people don't know what they don't know. And young people can't just be older people. And older people can't just be younger people. And there are discrete stages of life that come with a lot of specific changes that you really cannot predict until you're there. So honestly, I would always go for a therapist with lived experience if I were you guys, because I didn't know anything when I was young at all. I didn't know about being a mother before I was a mother. I didn't know about being a mother of a teenager when I was the mother of a baby. I didn't know about divorce and remarriage till I had divorced and remarried. You know, there's some kind of a superstitious belief that I guess people have to have where, you know, there's some sort of training that people can get that approximate life experience. And it's just not true. That's not real. People are always like, well, you know, like, do you need like an oncologist that's had cancer? I would prefer an oncologist that's had cancer. Yep, 100%. In fact, I don't know any reasonable person that would not, if all else was equal, prefer an oncologist who, sure, knew about cancer, was trained in how to treat cancer, understood it, yeah, and had cancer. I mean, that would be like, holy shit. That would be like the holy grail there would be somebody who had that lived experience. 1,000% I'd rather an oncologist that had cancer, or second runner-up had a loved one with cancer, right, than somebody who didn't. You know, so yeah, sure, look at your therapist training and their background, but never, ever think that some sort of degree that they have is going to be a replacement for lived experience. I mean, it's just not true. I have coaches that are way better than a therapist without that same lived experience. If it's like a coach who's 50 years old, guess what? They've been in their 40s. And if you get a therapist who's in their 30s that's telling you they know what it's like to be in their 40s, they just don't. Just like I don't know what it's like to be in my 60s or my 50s, you know, or my 70s, or, you know, then whatever else is on the number line, my 90s. I mean, but what I do know is how to be in midlife. And I didn't know that before. I had no idea, except from, you know, intellectually I understood, but emotionally and experientially I didn't. And it's the same thing when people, you know, try to date or marry people at much different life stages than them. That, you know, can be rough long term. And I have multiple podcasts about that. But generally, somebody that's at your same stage of life is the best fit. And thankfully, you know, the average age gap is like 18 months or something, or maybe 2.5 years. It's something between those, you know, and that's great because lived experience is huge, whether it's a romantic relationship, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a friend, anything. What else have I learned? Your body changes as you grow, and your brain is part of your body, and that changes too. And no, age is not just a number, as I say so many times. You could be super sex positive and have a super high sex drive in your 30s, and you get to your 40s and you don't. And you get to your 50s and you really don't, you know, and it's nothing you can predict. And it's certainly better to be sex positive than not, because you still understand if your partner has a drive and you may be more willing to compromise. But there's nobody that does not have the biology of aging and stage changes therein. There's nobody that does not have any susceptibility to the honeymoon stage and the honeymoon stage ending. That's a biological thing. When you just had a baby, you think 1,000 times different than when you have a teenager. That's why all these people have babies and they get estranged from their parents, because they're like, oh my God, my parent was such a piece of shit, because, I would never treat my beloved baby who's so perfect in any sort of bad way by, like, if, for example, invalidating them. And then that kid gets to be a teenager and you're like, oh, okay. There's a long road of parenting, and that's usually when many people say, oh, I can more understand why my parents struggle because they were aging and they struggle with their mental health and this and that. But you can't feel like that until you've been frustrated by a child, right? You can't be frustrated by a baby in the way you could be frustrated by a teenager. You can't even be frustrated by a toddler the way you could be frustrated by a teenager or a young adult or anything like that. So as people age, they get so much less judgmental if they're healthy people. If they're people who struggle with a lot of unresolved trauma and childhood issues and have a very rigid thinking style, then they get more rigid as they age. But if you're emotionally healthy, you tend to mellow as you age because you get wiser. That's real. You understand more about people. You see patterns everywhere. At this point, people come into my office and I know what dynamic they're in within like the first 4 seconds, before they speak. I know it from the intake forms, but you got to let people talk or they get annoyed. Everybody wants to talk. Okay. But but the point is like you can really spot patterns, and there's only really a few patterns that people have in relationships or like anywhere, like in any job that you have. You can get so good at being basically a fortune teller and predicting things. Why? Because you have so much experience with it. So, for example, my kid was texting with a friend, and I said, oh, your friend has ADHD. and my kid's like, no, they don't. And the next day they're like, my friend said that they have ADHD. And I'm like, well, who said that? And it was just from texting, because of course, what do I do all day? A lot of the people I talk to have ADHD. So I know what that is very, very well. And so it makes you look like a psychic, but in reality, you just have experience. And as I said, there's really no replacement for lived experience. And experience can help you with empathy. It can help you with perspective taking. The longer you live, the more you know, for example, that like a marital fight is just going to end. It's not going to end the relationship. In most cases, it's just a fight. People have to calm down, get back together and figure it out. But it's your stress levels at the moment of a fight are usually not gonna continue. They're never gonna continue. They're gonna drop from that peak of anger. And so as you see this longer term, you work with more and more couples and you're alive for longer, then you can tell that most people have many, many opportunities to reconcile. Most fights are not deal-breaking fights. People's emotions wax and wane. Biology is real. How a woman feels when she's menstruating is completely not how she feels when she's ovulating. How she feels before menopause has no correlation to how she feels after menopause. How a man feels in his 20s or 30s when he's like impulsive and driven by sex, and men that cheat literally in their 20s and 30s frequently calm down in their 40s and 50s because their drive just goes down. So yes, there's sex addicts and people that continue to cheat forever, but aging is real. And it's just like a person who's 17 years old will be in a more dramatic relationship than somebody who's at 27, than somebody who's 37, than somebody who's 47, right? Well, it's the same thing with bad behavior. So much changes as you just grow and mature, and that starts to seem super obvious the older you get. When you're younger, you feel like this person's personality isn't going to shift, but in fact, personalities shift all the time. Now, the number one thing that I've seen to predict happy relationships long term, as I've discussed frequently, is open-mindedness. So people do, again, if they're healthy, they get more open-minded over time. They start to think, well, shit, I didn't know anything when I was young, so I'm going to give that person who's young a lot of leeway. Or I now know that, people change and grow constantly, so I won't assume that what somebody says now is what they're going to say a year from now. And things like that. And you know this if you've talked to older experts, like if you've talked to lawyers or doctors that are older, they usually have a longer term view. Like, you know what, this is probably not going to be the end of the world. There's a million ways to deal with things. Maybe something will just go away. We'll wait and see, Whereas younger people in all professions, doctors, lawyers, therapists, whatever, they're like, let's deal with it right now because I cannot possibly imagine that it could just remit, because they've had really no experience with anything long-term just remitting. And in terms of compatibility, I would say at this stage of the game, being a friend trumps everything. And that just makes sense when I go back and I'm like, why in my early career were these people, because sometimes people reach back out, right? And they're still struggling. And you worked with them like 10 years ago. I'm old enough now for that to have happened, that people reach out from 10 years ago, even more. And then you see that sometimes they are still struggling with the same relationship issues. Why? Because the friendship isn't there. They don't really love and respect each other deeply as much as they would like a best friend. The friendship can, unless there's like super huge issues, addiction and untreated mental health issues, recurring infidelity, these big, big things. Then if you're a friend, if you're a deep friend, then that can really fix everything, fix most things. That's the core. The core is not the sexual attraction. The core is not how often you're doing, you're having sex or how often you're making out or how often you're going on date night or doing all these little, indicators that people kind of, again, superstitiously believe are going to predict whether their marriage succeeds. It's, do you like hanging out with each other? Yeah, you can't be grossed out by each other, but honestly, when the people come in and they say that they're grossed out by their partner, invariably they're not really friends with this person. They don't respect the person. Because if you're a person that cares that much what somebody looks like, and then they don't make themselves look better, then you don't respect them. Like you really don't. So the respect and the deep friendship, that is the core. That's what, by the way, infidelity and dishonesty can really mess with, is this core friendship. Because then you feel like, who is this person? They're like a stranger. I never knew them. That's a huge empathic rupture because it ruptures the friendship, But these sort of empathic ruptures generally have to do with losing respect for the person, losing respect for them and trust. And that's why they are so important to discuss in couples counseling. It's not, usually the sexual piece has to do deeply with incompatibility. If somebody is closed-minded and somebody is open-minded, they will not be sexually compatible. So these core personality traits, it's very important to be compatible on those and to be friends on that level, because those are at the root of all of these sexual issues. For example, if somebody is not good in bed, they can get better in bed as long as they are open-minded to receiving feedback. If somebody's defensive and closed-minded, they're bad in bed, they're going to stay bad in bed forever. So if you're an open-minded person with a closed-minded person, eventually you don't want to deal with it anymore. And that's real. The other thing that I've learned is that, sometimes divorce is the answer. Sometimes you're just banging your head against the wall with somebody who you're never, ever going to be compatible with, and you get out, and assuming that you have done the work of figuring out your own weaknesses and your own flaws and your own contribution to the dissolution of your prior marriage, then you can get into a much better marriage. That's the truth, and I see it all the time, is that people come in and very, very frequently I think, well, this is a compatibility issue that you guys are not framing as a compatibility issue because it's too scary to do so. And a lot of times couples can make it work, even if they're not compatible on a deep level, because they do love each other, they have kids, they have a motivator. But some of those, by the way, stop after the kids leave because the motivator isn't there anymore. So they did their job. They stayed together till the kids were older. And then at that point, it becomes very obvious to both that they really don't want to hang out anymore. And I really do not consider that a failure. I consider that like a career would not be a failure if it was a 20-year career. Well, a 20-year marriage is not a failure either. A failure is hurting people. If you're hurting your kids with constant fighting, or you're hurting your kids by divorcing and then bringing a million different partners around them and making them very anxious, or you're partying all the time. I mean, whatever. If you deal poorly with either being married or being divorced, then yeah, that's a tragedy. But positive things where people try to stay together and be happy for the kids, if that's a valid choice. People divorce and try to make two stable homes for the kids. That's a valid choice as well. It's a hell of a lot better than fighting and yelling like lunatics, which I see more and more with every passing year of my life is very bad for children. I knew it was bad. And it's only been borne out how bad it is, because now I've actually seen people that have kids, right? Little kids when they started seeing me, then they come back, or they've been seeing me this whole time, and they have teenagers or young adult kids that are really angry and say, I was not happy as a kid because y'all were fighting all the time. I was not happy as a kid because you guys were, not making it a stable and calm home. And I had to parent you. I fell through your marital issues. Like, I knew this stuff. This I knew for sure, because this, as I've told you guys multiple times, was the way that I grew up, with a lot of fighting. But, you don't really know how bad things are until you start seeing it over and over repeat in your clinical work, right, as a therapist. And boy, that one was right. Out of many things I got wrong, that one was right. Some of the things I got wrong when I was younger, where I thought that sex drive was just chosen. You just put in your effort, get in the mood, and then you're going to just have fun. And boy, did I realize that was wrong. The first time I breastfed was the first time I had a hormonal change where my sex drive just dropped off the map. And I was like, oh shit, I guess this is a biological thing that other people deal with. And those women must feel like this. The women that I was like, responsive desire will just kick in. No, it doesn't. Not all the time. Certainly it can, it can, but sometimes it can't. And I assume that is a great deal of what it feels like when menopause happens, where you're just like, why am I doing this? This is just like not what I'm doing. And some people can still have sex, and if you're more open-minded, you can get to a place of compromise. Other people can't, but thinking that biology doesn't matter is crazy. So that's my summary. Biology matters. Lived experience matters. It is important to have positive intentions for your family, for your children, and not just intentions, but to follow through with calm and stable home lives for your kids. Compatibility is real. You cannot hammer a square peg into a round hole. So many of the people that I work with, if they're married to these avoidant partners, honestly, who wish that they didn't ever have to have any sort of romantic interaction with them at all, who just kind of want to do their own thing, honestly, well, that is an easy person to be divorced from. It really is. If you've tried everything, you've gone to couples therapy, you've worked on your own stuff, you've stopped being so needy, you've stopped being difficult in the ways that you were, and they're still avoidant, and in fact, now you're further apart because you're not pursuing them all the time, then you only do have one life, and you got to think about, try to get into maybe a relationship where you like to hang out with each other. That's pretty much, a good baseline, where you like to hang out with your partner and you don't feel that you're coercing them into hanging out with you. And that's all, folks. So I am 45 now, and I am in my mid 40s. This is the midpoint right here. And as always, actually, if you write into me for a therapist or a coach, I always do say when somebody is struggling with a certain thing, like, for example, an estranged child or a divorce or whatever, I always do recommend people with lived experience, because I think it is super, super important. Experience of being a parent, an experience of being divorced, experience of having a blended family, whatever the case may be, experience of being an older person, all of that stuff. All right, guys, I will talk to you soon, and have a great day. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.